Welcome to the Respectful Leader Challenge. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. So, who is this presentation for? Folks in HR, leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, learning and development and training, as well as organizational development and culture development. So, in the next hour, I promise to provide you some useful information and data that I think is very germane to what's going on right now, and also to give you some tools and techniques that will be useful for you going forward in relation to what's going on these days. That'll include a simple technique to improve communication, a principle that fosters better teamwork, as well as a practice that will instantly reduce upset and defensiveness, and a way of collaborating that invites people to consider other points of view, and a framework for delivering feedback effectively and respectfully. And we hope you'll stick around because at the end of the program, I'll give you an opportunity for some coaching, and we'll also put the calendar link in the chat if you need to head out earlier. Who am I? Well, I'm Gregg Ward. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Respectful Leadership. I've been doing this work for a very long time. Actually, I started as a trainer for the New York City Police Department, which involved a lot of understanding about the relationships between police officers and the public that they serve, and how respect and or disrespect played a critical role in whether encounters between police and civilians went well or not. And eventually, I started to work as a freelance correspondent overseas in Europe for BBC Radio and a number of other UK media. And I had the good fortune of being able to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which makes me old and a baby boomer, but it was a pivotal point in world history, and I was really glad to have been there. Since then, I've been doing a great deal of work in the area of DE&I and respect and respectful leadership, and founded the Center for Respectful Leadership in 2019. And I've also had the really good fortune of having a book that I wrote called The Respectful Leader, which is a business fable. It's not a big tome. It's a business fable, was picked up by John Wiley and Sons and published in 2016. And surprise to all of us, I did not expect to get it picked up and published by Wiley. It became a bestseller instantaneously, partly because Amazon named it a best book of the month, which was incredibly cool and unexpected. And shortly after, it won a very prestigious award, which is hanging above my shoulder here on my wall because I'm super proud of it. And also, I've been doing coaching and consulting for many, many years with major clients such as Booz Allen Hamilton and AXA and ADP, Intel, Qualcomm, Ford, Harley Davidson. I've just been able to work with a whole bunch of different global companies. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be of service to them. So who are we? The Center for Respectful Leadership is on a mission to support leadership and organizational transformation through the positive power and measurable impact of respect. I do a lot of keynoting. We do seminars, learning and development programs on respect and what we call respectful leadership. We talk about helping organizations build what we call actively respectful cultures, do a lot of individual executive coaching. We do a lot of research and publications, and our training programs often feature the use of live professional theater, which we think is one of the most powerful ways to make a contribution to someone's life, is when they get a real chance to practice their skills in person on professional actors who stay in character the whole time. And we also provide an alternative dispute resolution and restoring respect service. And we also certify heads of HR, for example, in how to run our coaching for respect process. Okay, so I have a question for all of you. Does this sound like your organization? There's friction between individuals, groups, and generations. often resulting from conscious and unconscious behaviors that others find disrespectful. This can be very challenging. Are you seeing people stereotype each other based upon putting each other in boxes, which is what we do as human beings, and assuming that you are always going to behave as the box tells you you're supposed to behave? Are people miscommunicating with each other? For example, are they listening not to understand, but rather just to respond? Again, that's part of the human condition. Or are they not sharing information with each other because of silo mentality and saying, my department's better than yours, so I'm not going to help you out? Or we're good over here, we don't need your help, and so on. That's very common in many organizations. Are you seeing the challenge of conflicts between so-called personality conflicts around their behavioral styles between groups who are in silent or even just individuals? One of the things we often see is someone's been around, they're a senior rainmaker, they've been behaving disrespectfully forever and ever and ever, but no one's ever called them on it because they're a senior rainmaker. And besides, what's respectful to me is disrespectful to you, and we can't quite figure it out. So let's not talk about it. That's very, very common. And then, of course, there's the dismissiveness that we see that people are claiming that people are too sensitive, and they just can't accept feedback, and so on and so forth. So all of these challenges are very common in most workplaces. And I'm curious, show of hands, how many of you are seeing these challenges in your workplace? I'm probably going to see all of the hands go up. Is that fair? Yep. There's
Yes.
at least one. All right. So why is this happening? Great question. Well, partly because there are 5 generations at work. Right now, there are 5 different generations operating in our workplace. There's the silent or so-called traditional generation. There's baby boomers like me. Do I have any other baby boomers on the call? Chris, I think, are you a baby boomer or you're Gen X? You're Gen
I'm
X.
X. Yep.
You're X, all right.
Yep.
So I'm the only baby boomer on the call, and then of course we have Gen Xers. So Chris, you're a Gen X. Who else is do I have other Gen X on the calls?
Yeah, that's just funny. I am.
All right, Bonnie. And then of course we have millennials and Jason. Jason, are you a Gen Xer too? And then we have millennials and Gen Z. And by the way, interesting stat. Currently, 38% of the global workforce is made up of millennials and Generation Z. By 2030, that number will rise to 58%. Nearly 60% of our workforces across the globe will either be millennials or Gen Z, and they're already starting to move into leadership positions. So different, so unique, not what anybody anticipated happening in their own lifetimes.
Yeah.
Here's some more reasons why we have challenges like these at work. Public disrespect. Our research tells us that there's more public disrespect in our society going on now than there has been since the top of the Vietnam War in the late
Wow.
60s. It's really high. And remember, we didn't have these things. We didn't have mobile phones going on back then. We had newspapers and we had television and radio. And so what's happened is we are all being bombarded constantly with media that tells us everything's horrible. People are treating each other horrible. And that's because, and those of you who have worked in media, as I have, and I know Chris, you have, there's an old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Any kind of violence or controversy is going to be the headline because they know it drives eyeballs. And so there's this constant saturation of negativity, of incivility, of public attacks and violence, and it just goes on and on and on. And is it any surprise that many people say, I don't watch the news anymore? I can't take it. How many of you have just like, I can't take it anymore and have stopped? There's one, okay.
I
Uh,
have. I
and
stopped.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you. And I wouldn't watch it either if it wasn't a part of my responsibility of
Yeah.
as the executive director of the Center for Respectful Leadership. I have to watch and see what's going on. So, the other things that are going on that are contributing to all of this is the aftershock of the pandemic. And we saw, if you remember, the great resignation going on during the pandemic, which we at the center called the great reconsideration. People were reconsidering their lives, people were dying. And they were saying to themselves, do I really want to stick around in this job that I really don't like? Or do I want to try to find something that's more fulfilling and better for me? And what's very odd is the social science right now is even though overall economic indicators such as unemployment, the stock market, there's a whole bunch of other indicators out there that say that our economy is actually not bad. It's actually okay. It's pretty good. But people don't feel that way. There's a very strange disconnect. So overall, most people are not feeling like we have returned to normal the way things were before the pandemic. Contributing to that is something that's called a VUCA environment. Now, VUCA, the phrase VUCA, how many of you are familiar with VUCA? Anybody familiar with that? It comes out of the U.S. Army War College. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The War College decided this is a great way to describe a battlefield and how the soldiers will operate in a VUCA battlefield environment. Well, business schools started to look at this and said, you know what? That kind of describes the business environment. Now, a VUCA incident used to only occur maybe once or twice a year. Do any of you remember when that giant ocean freighter got caught wedged in the Suez Canal and they couldn't get it out? It totally blew up supply chains all over the world. I have clients who are heads of supply, and they were tearing their hair out. They were just going crazy trying to figure out how to keep their manufacturing operating, how to keep everything flowing. It was a chaotic time. Well, that used to only occur in business on occasion, every year, maybe twice a year, and everyone would scramble and figure out how to address it, and then things would go back to normal. What we are seeing now is a constant VUCA business environment with constant things changing and churning, surprises. We're also having a political environment which is constantly in upheaval, and this also infects our social environment. So the bottom one is really the key. When we are trying to operate in VUCA environments, the number one result is stress. People get stressed out by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I know I get super tense when I feel a sense of loss of control. And that is common for most people. And there's an old saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. I think that's true, but I've modified that phrase as well in terms of respect. When the going gets tough, people get tough on each other. And so stress can cause us to treat each other with disrespect. And all the experts agree that stress is the number one contributor to disrespectful behavior between people. Here's some troubling trends. Those of you who are in HR, you may have seen this. Society of Human Resources Management recently released this data in January. 66% of workers have experienced or witnessed incivility within the past month. 57% have experienced or witnessed it within the past week. Not good, not good. And 1 in 4 workers experience disrespect and incivility on a regular basis. And these are pretty hefty surveys. These are not, just light, low samplings. These are pretty big surveys. Now, Georgetown University has been studying disrespect for over 25 years. And during the pandemic, they did a survey of approximately 1,000 people who were considered essential workers, such as grocery store workers, such as healthcare workers, folks who had to work during the pandemic. And they asked them a very simple question. Have you been treated with disrespect by either a customer or a patient on an average of once a month during the pandemic? And if you look at the third column, 76% of respondents said yes. 76%. Now, look at the first column. 78% said they witnessed fellow employees being disrespected. 78% in the next column believe it's more common than 5 years ago, before the pandemic. And the fourth column is very distressing. 73% of respondents think this is normal. That's just the way it is. That's not good. That's not healthy. What's resulting from all of this is employee net promoter scores are at 4-year lows. Last quarter of 2023, employee or what they call ENPS score was at 39. And those of you who are familiar with with NPS, 100 is the best and negative 100 is the worst. So 39 is not good at all. And in every industry except for, interestingly enough, construction and tourism, and ENPS, employee net promoter scores, were down significantly. Not good. And you may be seeing this in your own workplaces. So I'm curious, Jason, Michelle, Bonnie, Jabari, are you seeing things like this going on in your workplace? Please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. Michelle, you're on mute. There you go.
I started a new role in January of this year, but prior to that, I was working at an organization for about almost 4 years. So I think to what you are speaking of, Greg, is I probably saw that quite a bit in my previous workplace. That had, there was a lot of people working there. So it's certainly, with all these different generations that you were speaking to at the beginning of this presentation. So I can see that, different priorities, different expectations,
Yes.
You
Yes.
deal with that when not just by differences of people, but literally by generations as well. So it's
Yes.
just very layered,
Yeah.
a lot of moving parts.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Jason, how about you or Jabari?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of piggyback on what Michelle was saying, I'm actually starting a business, and so we're all young. The team has the highest tenured person has been around for 3 years, but there's still a lot of that dynamic of everybody. Although we all are unified behind a vision, we all have different expectations and needs on our path to achieving that vision. And so, that coupled with the fact that we are a 100% remote organization, it's tricky making sure that we're, keeping that open communication and facilitating success for each other.
That's a very good point. And that was a big change from the pandemic. Before the pandemic, most of us were not remote. And I just happen to be, because I've been remote consultant and trainer for 25, 30 years. So that was very common and I was comfortable with that. But most organizations were people coming into workplaces. And then that was flipped literally overnight within a matter of a couple of months. And we're seeing now some of the impact of that. For example, the mandatory return to office requirements. The people are really pushing back on that, especially millennials and Gen Zs are going, "Hey, I'm functioning just fine remote. Why do you want me to come back in the office? I mean, what's the deal?" You may have also heard SAP, the giant software company in Europe. They had, during the pandemic, they said, "Okay, now everyone's remote, full time, no problem. It's all good." And they did well during the pandemic. And then the leadership turned around a few months ago and said, "Nope, we want everybody to come back in the office." And 8,000 employees signed a petition that basically said, if you force us to go back to the office, we will quit and we will go to work for a competitor. And now all of a sudden SAP is saying, well, let's see if we can create a hybrid environment that works for all. So that was a big, they really had to take a step back from that. Anybody else? Bonnie or Jabari, thoughts?
Will you ask the question once more?
Yes. Are you seeing, I referenced some of the kind of behaviors that we're seeing in many different workplaces, and I'm wondering if you're seeing things like this in your work environment.
I work with a lot of organizations doing similar work, DEI trainings, and I do notice many of the behaviors that you were naming. And I would say that our hope is to invite people into a deeper relationship through, communication and supporting them with the tools to be able to do that. So I often find it really shocking how much progress we can make in a short period of time with genuine conversation.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that, because you've kind of helped me to segue with where I'm going today. Thank you. Appreciate that. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, this could be something you all very much know, which is disrespect is very expensive. There was some research done at USC, Georgetown, Arizona State, and Oakland University that found that if we were a room of 100 people and we'd felt that we'd been treated with disrespect in our workplaces, 80 of us would actually lose work time ruminating or worrying about the incident, thinking about what happened. 78 of us would say our commitment to our organization had declined as a result of the incident. 66 of us would report that our performance had declined. 47 of us would decrease our time spent doing work. And 38 of us would deliberately decrease the quality of our work. That is very concerning. Also, MIT did a study back in January of 22 during the so-called Great Resignation, which we again called the Great Reconsideration. And what they were looking at is reasons why people were leaving. And what they found is that a toxic corporate culture, one where there is a lot of disrespect, is 10 times more likely to contribute to attrition than compensation. Toxic corporate culture, defined as employees feel disrespected, where diversity and inclusion are not valued, and unethical behavior is tolerated and or encouraged. That kind of culture is 10 times more likely to cause someone to quit than poor compensation. One thing I want to point out is, yeah, there are some direct costs to disrespect, such as interventions and complaints and investigations and so on, and maybe even lawsuits. But the indirect costs can sometimes be twice as much. For example, if somebody quits because they feel disrespected, you've got to recruit somebody new, you got to train them, get them all back up to speed. And what about the time that's lost while they're gone? But I think one of the most important indirect costs of disrespect is hard to put a number on. And that's the cost to your organization's reputation as a great place to work. Back in the old days before social media, who did we tell when we were upset with our companies? Who did we tell? Family and friends. Today, who do we tell?
Social media.
Social media and Glassdoor. How many of you are familiar or even looking at your company's Glassdoor account? If you're in HR, I'm pretty sure you're watching the Glassdoor account to see what people are saying. So the game has changed so radically that we have to pay attention not only to the direct costs of disrespect, but the indirect costs. So what I want to do is honor my promise. I want to give you some tools and techniques that may be useful to you in moving the needle forward on respect. As Jabari said, communication is one of the greatest ways to reduce conflict, to help folks work together in a respectful and civil environment. Unfortunately, sometimes it feels like we're sitting down with someone and someone's barking and we're meowing. So one of the things we want people to remember is there's this little tool called active or reflective listening. You're probably all familiar with it. It's simply saying to the person, "Hey, Chris, I think what I heard you say is this, this, and this. Have I got that right?" And if Chris says you got that right, then Chris will feel heard. His perspective will be, at least he'll feel like where he's coming from is understood by the other person. Now, even though I may disagree with Chris, the fact that I have reflected back what he said will make it much more likely that we can have a productive conversation. I didn't just listen and then say, okay, I disagree, and here's why. I at least heard him out, and psychologically, he'll be more likely to be open to my perspective. So, active listening is one of the key respectful leadership tools that we recommend everyone, every leader in every organization be using this technique all of the time. The second is promoting psychological safety. I'm sure you're all familiar with this term. Google did a very exhaustive study of their organization. And they released a report called Project Aristotle. And essentially, what that study did is they were looking at answering one fundamental question: why did some teams at Google succeed really, really well in meeting their goals, and other teams failed miserably? What was the key factors involved? Now, Project Aristotle identified about 10 factors, but the number one, the most important factor, was psychological safety. What is psychological safety? Well, it's where you and I feel safe enough to disagree with our group and not feel like we're going to be attacked or ridiculed or sidelined, where it's possible for me to give you as my leadership an opposing point of view or a different idea, a different perspective, without fear of being disrespected or ridiculed or sidelined. That's part of psychological safety. The other part of Jody Brockington, hello, hello, my friend, welcome. So good to see you. And you're on mute, Jody.
No, I said I regret coming into this late, but I have a standing Thursday meeting.
Thank you so much for coming. And just to catch you up to speed, I've first given some data on what's going on in our workplaces about the high levels of disrespect and what are the causes of those. And now I'm talking about some of the things that we can do to reduce the stress, reduce disrespect and incivility in our workplaces. I talked about just now the tool of reflective or active listening, and now I'm talking about psychological safety. And the second part of psychological safety is where we have a team of established behaviors and norms that is acceptable to all. It's one thing to be able to disagree with your leadership without fear of ridicule, but it's a whole nother thing to make sure that everyone is on the same page with how we're going to operate with each other. And we're going to take care of each other. If someone is under stress, we're going to take care of each other. If someone needs help, we're going to take care of them and then step back when that help is no longer needed. So it's that sense that we're all in this together. We all have agreements on how we're going to treat each other. And it can be very, very powerful when you're part of a team that has very high levels of psychological safety. Now, I want to tell you a quick story because I live in San Diego, and a lot of my friends are former Navy, and some of them are former Navy SEALs. And one day I was at a bar with them, And there were about 4 other SEALs, their former SEALs there, and they'd all worked together. And the way they treated each other, my jaw hit the floor. The things they said to each other was like, oh my goodness, I would never say that to my best friend. And the words they were using, and they would laugh and tease each other. And I said, is this how you operated when you were in country during active duty? And they're like, hell yes, this is how we treat each other. And I'm like, wow, I don't know if I could survive in that environment. And they said, look, Greg, you have to understand, we have seen some of the ugliest parts of human behavior in ever. And we have a kind of very twisted humor about it because that's how we keep our sanity. But secondly, we have a camaraderie together. We have been through the worst of worst together. We have survived and we've come out the other side. And I'll tell you what, Greg, we may tease each other and abuse each other here at the bar, but if we were in the middle of the firefight, that guy's my brother. She's my sister. I will lay down my life for them. And we are not teasing each other at all. We are working as one. And I said, gosh, I guess you do have a lot of psychological safety. And they said, absolutely. We totally will die for each other. And that is a very powerful statement. So it doesn't have to be, people often say to me, oh, Greg, you just want me to be nice. This whole respect thing, it's just you want me to be nice. No, no, no. No, no, no. I want you to be respectful, but you could be really direct with someone and still be respectful in a way that no one would consider was nice. If I bring you flowers at work, that's nice, but that's not necessarily being a respectful leader. Sometimes I need to be very direct with my feedback, but I can do that in a way that doesn't ridicule you or disrespect you or dehumanize you. So I learned a lot of lessons from my Navy SEAL buddies, including how to stay calm when things get completely out of control. But that's another tool. Okay. So when people get upset, usually when people feel disrespected, they go to a very emotional place. And there's some neuroscience behind that, which is rather complicated. But bottom line is this: when you feel disrespected, your primitive brain is reacting and releasing powerful hormones into your bloodstream, such as cortisol, the stress hormone, norepinephrine, which is a lubricant to help your muscles get ready to go into fight, flight, or freeze, and of course, adrenaline and a whole bunch of other hormones. So when you're filled up with negative hormones like those, there's not a lot of thinking going on. So when people are upset, they're feeling disrespected, you might need to use what we call the H.E.A.R technique. H stands for hear. Hear the E, the emotion in their voice. Look for it in their body. You can tell when someone's upset. It's not that hard to see. And then acknowledge it. That's what the A stands for. Just acknowledge it. Chris, I can tell you're upset. Chris, I can tell you're frustrated. Chris, I totally get how frustrating and upsetting this can be for you. Psychologically, when I acknowledge Chris's upset by simply calling it what it is, he is more likely to calm down and think about what's happening in a more rational, cognitive way, which is really what we want, right? I mean, how many of you have had someone in your office and they are really upset? Maybe they're tears, they're cursing, they're angry. There's no reasoning with that person. All you can do is say, here's a box of tissue. Go ahead, take as many as you want. And eventually, if you acknowledge the upset, you don't have to agree with them, but just acknowledge it, they will start to calm down. And the R stands for respectful remarks. Tell people who are upset what you respect them for. There's nothing wrong with that. You may not respect them for the way they're behaving, but there are other things that you might respect them for. Maybe it's their knowledge, maybe it's their experience, maybe it's their talents and skills. Psychologically, bless you, Michelle, I think you sneezed. Psychologically, when we tell others what we respect them for, their primitive brain is also triggered, and a very powerful hormone called oxytocin is released. They actually feel good. It's also known as the love or the bonding hormone. So when you say to someone, you know, I respect you, Chris, for your enormous experience. You have worked at so many different organizations. I have enormous respect for that. And that comes from a sincere place in my heart. Chris, you probably feel good. And I know it's true. You have worked in so many different organizations, and I have so much respect for you. And that makes that Chris will have a very good feeling as a result of that. So if you have someone who's upset, feeling disrespected, acknowledge their emotions using the H.E.A.R technique. H stands for hear, E stands for emotion, A stands for acknowledge, and R stands for respectful remarks. Okay? Another thing that you can do in your organization is adopt what we call the coaching mindset. How many of you, do I have any executive coaches here on the call? Ah, Jody, I know you do this. Very good. So when I say that to you, Jody, what does that mean? What does a coaching mindset mean to you?
It means that I'm doing all the things you just said, the active listening, to all of that. And although I might want to say something to someone, that I need to hold back, even if I have solutions and ways to solve a problem, that I'm waiting for them to solve it themselves, for them to hear themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And you're probably doing that by asking questions.
Correct.
Asking, right? Asking questions that provoke insights, that cause them to think about things from a different point of view, rather than telling them, you need to think about this from another point of view. Brilliant. Thank you. So when we have a program called the Respectful Leader Workshop, when we take and it's designed for frontline managers, people who very often in most organizations these days are new managers, are technical experts, they're subject matter experts. They've been trained in a lot of engineers and cyber security experts and so on in technology fields. These folks haven't had a lot of exposure to psychological safety or emotional intelligence in their training. They're subject matter experts, and then they get promoted into a leadership role, a management role, without a lot of training on how to manage people. And so one of the things we want them to adopt is what we call a coaching mindset, so that they're not just telling their employees what to do and solving their problems for them. Instead, they're coaching their employees to come up with their own solutions and address their own challenges and issues rather than always having to swoop in and fix things. But our tendency as human beings is to fix things. That's how my first marriage ended. My first wife wanted just to have someone to listen. And what I would do, I'd hear the problem and I'd jump right in and fix it. And towards the end of the marriage, she said, you know, you're always trying to fix things. I just wanted someone to hear me. And I'm like, oh boy, that wasn't bright. And I learned that lesson. And now I like to think I'm a really good listener in my marriage. And so helping our managers and leadership become coaches is one of the best things we can do to create a kind of coaching culture and mindset within the organization. And there's a lot of practices there. There's a lot of things that they can do and learn, and it takes a little time. But I can tell you, how many of you have had a manager who had a coaching mindset? Anybody had a manager like that?
Yeah.
A boss like that? Don't you love working for that person? Loved working for that person. I had one and I still years ago, and I still always think of them. I reach out to them now and then, and I tell them again and again and again what a terrific boss they were and how their mindset helped me so much. And then finally, the framework for providing feedback respectfully and effectively. Given that we have workplaces that are being really challenged now by uncivil, and disrespectful behavior, it's our roles as leaders in our organizations to nip that in the bud. We don't want that little stuff to grow and become a mountain, from a molehill to a mountain. We want it to be nipped in the bud so that it doesn't cause lasting damage. One of the ways to do that is by providing feedback respectfully and effectively. We use a model that comes from the Center for Creative Leadership that they developed back in the 1970s, and it's called SBIR. The S stands for situation, the B stands for behavior, the I stands for impact, and the R stands for request. So if you've got somebody on your team who's behaving disrespectfully, one of the classic examples is Ian the interrupter. I've had somebody on my team named Ian. Great guy, does a lot of great work, but he just interrupts everybody on the team all the time. And did you know, by the way, that women report being interrupted at work is the most common disrespectful behavior? Interesting. And I'm probably seeing women nod on this call. It's the most common disrespectful behavior reported by women in the workplace. So let's say I've got Ian the interrupter. What I might do is take Ian aside and say, hey, Ian, do you remember the meeting we had this morning? And Jabari was there, and Bonnie was there, and Jason was there, and Michelle was there, and Jody was there, and Chris was there. Oh, yeah, Ian says. Yeah, I remember. Said, well, here's what I noticed. Here's the behavior that I noticed, that you had a tendency to interrupt folks as they were in the middle of speaking. Now, Ian is likely to get a little bit defensive right off the bat. So what I'm going to want to do is put on my coaching hat and saying, would you be willing to talk about this? And by the way, I know this is a frustrating conversation. I'm using the H.E.A.R technique. So what I'm trying to do is help Ian understand that his behaviors have impact on others. I'm sure Jody felt a little disrespected when you interrupted her. Jabari, the same. In fact, I feel disrespected when you interrupt me. And I know that may not be your intention. And here's where I might say, you know what, Ian, I respect you for your drive. You want to get things done. And remember the psychology there. If I tell him what I respect him for, he's more likely to be open to what I have to say. And so, Ian, I want to make a request of you. I want you to hold off on interrupting. Why don't you make a note and give me a signal? If you have something important to say, make a note about it. Give me a signal. I'll come to you when Michelle has finished speaking. I'll come to you when Jody has finished speaking. Rest assured, you will be given an opportunity to give your input. So that is the SBIR technique, bearing in mind that the person you're trying to nip their disrespect in the bud, they might get a little bit defensive about it. And so you're going to want to have that coaching mindset, use the H.E.A.R technique and respectful remarks to help them stay calm. Before I move forward, I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with these tools and techniques or know some of them? Do you have any questions that I can answer about them for you? Everybody okay?
Well, since you're talking about generations, do some of these show up in different, besides gender kind of issues that you've also brought up, but
Yes.
generationally, do they show up differently? And sometimes could be missed is
Yes.
more like, I feel like, as much as I feel I'm hearing, listening, watching, observing, that, you miss something, right? A statement, an eye roll. I don't, so I'm just curious if there's some repetitiveness in certain generations in these areas.
Jody, thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. I know how I have two stepdaughters, and when they were teenagers, how they used to eye roll at me, and it would trigger me like nobody's business. I found it to be extraordinarily disrespectful. And this was a while ago. I didn't have access to these tools. And so I was not as respectful as I could have been. It's all good now. And I also, if you remember that TV show, Mythbusters, where they began each show by saying, "We're professionals. Don't try this at home." These techniques that I'm showing you, they tend to work in the workplace, not necessarily work at home. Things are different at home. But at the end of the day, Jody, I think you're right that there are generational differences in behaviors and what we observe. And we need to be hyper aware as best we can of all the different perspectives that come to play in our very diverse work environments. And it's a full-time job. It's a full-time job to be aware and stay on top of all of this. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered your question. Bonnie, do you have a question?
I was just going to say my experience is that there is a cultural expectation on being very direct that I see with Gen Z. They just tell it like it is on social media. It's full transparency.
No
And I
filter.
think some of us may see that as disrespectful. It's cultural norm for them. It's a different level of communication that they are accustomed to culturally. And I think we just need to understand that going in.
We do. We do. And I have Gen Z that I've worked with who are exactly as you said, Bonnie. And what I try to do is in the SBIR technique, I go to impact. Just want you to know when you were that direct with Chris, I noticed he just kind of shut down. I just noticed that he was not listening anymore. So I don't think that's the impact you wanted to have with Chris. I think you were just, I respect you for your directness and your willingness to tell it like it is. But I got to tell you, I don't think Chris heard your perspective. I think he felt so taken aback by how you approached him with your perspective. He shut down. And I don't think that's the impact you want to have. Am I right? And usually they say, no, 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 that's not what I was doing. I didn't even think about that. I was just trying to, that's how I always am. And that's very common. In fact, you'll hear that from many different generations. So with that, I'm going to jump to the end. We have found that if you take on board these tools and techniques, that you're going to see increased collaboration among individuals and groups. You're also going to see that perspectives are more valued and considered by others. You're going to find there's better communication. People are sincerely listening to understand and are willing to share information more. And you'll find reduced conflicts. People are working together more effectively to get stuff done. And finally, you're going to see an overall increase in respect and people operating under what we all know of as the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. We have found that in an organization which has what we call an actively respectful culture, and people feel respected by their leadership, they are 63% more satisfied with their jobs, 55% more likely to be engaged, 58% more focused, and 100% more likely to stick around. I think those are good outcomes. Also, latest information from a large study done by Argyle Ledger, which is called their confidence report. Look at the top motivators for our employees. All employees report in 2024, respect, health benefits, and work-life balance are the top motivators for employees. Salary and salary and money are below that. Among people of color, respect is the top motivator. Among whites, it's still pretty high. Among women, it's still pretty high. And even among men, it's still pretty high. So today I promised I would give you a lot of data and information. I hope you found it to be useful. I also wanted to introduce some tools and techniques to you, including a communication technique, a principle that fosters better teamwork, a practice that reduces upset called the H.E.A.R Technique, a way of collaborating that invites people to consider other points of view, having a coaching mindset, and a framework for delivering feedback. I mentioned an opportunity for coaching. So at this point, the opportunity is simple. Choice you have, it's completely up to you. You can implement all of these tools and techniques that I just shared with you. That's terrific. I hope they're useful to you. I hope they work well for you. Or if you genuinely feel it would be helpful to have an outside perspective, then here's how it will work. All I would like to ask you to do is point your phone camera at this QR code and select a date. My calendar will pop up. Select a day or time to meet with me and answer a few questions about who you are and your organization. I assure you it will set up a call and then it'll be a short 15-minute Zoom call. I will not be doing any sales on this call. I will just be there to help you. And even if you wanted to pay me for that call, I will refuse the money. And I just want to be there to help you. And if you decide you would like to go forward and get more help, then we'll set up another call to make that happen. You'll also find the link to my calendar is in the chat. We've just got a few more minutes, and I'd just like to get some feedback from all of you. Was this helpful to you?
Yes.
Oh, look at that. Wow, Jason, that's cool. I love
Do
that.
that, Jason. Give
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts, feedback, questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question, Greg. In the examples that you were giving, um, where miss had happened, you had a conversation with the person who, let's say, caused the harm, and shared what you perceive that their intent was, or how you perceive the person who felt the negative impact. How they felt. And so the thing I was curious to know is, let's say in ideal situations, yes, the person's like, okay, I acknowledge, the impact I had and does differently. And there are moments where there's not true, where they feel it's not true that their impact, you know, should not have elicited certain, say response. So I'm curious to know, like, are there times where you like remove yourself as the middleman or person, what have you, and invite
That's
these two individuals in the conversation themselves?
that is a great question. My experience has been similar to what you just mentioned, that sometimes people will say, well, I didn't mean that. That wasn't my intention. And I don't know why they're upset. They shouldn't be
Mhm.
upset. And all I can do is give them my perspective of what I observed and what I noticed and how the impact of that behavior, they may not have intended that at all, but it's how it landed with the other person. And what I might also do is coach them on what they respect in the other person. Even though they were the one who was accused of being disrespectful, I'd say, hang on a second. I know you're a little bit upset, and I can understand your frustration at feeling like you're inappropriately being called disrespectful. What you might say to them, I might go on to say to them, setting that aside, what do you respect in the other person? And hopefully they have some level of respect for them. And that would be a place to start where I might say, well, if given that you do respect them for these things, might you be able to see how their point of view about your behavior might be different than what you thought? And hopefully they're a reasonable enough person to say, yes, I can see how they might see my behavior was disrespectful. And I might say, is there anything you want to do about that? I've had people say, you know what? I need to apologize. I didn't realize I was being disrespectful. I get it now. I need to apologize. And there's a process that I have that I've developed that I teach. And I would take them through that process of making what I call a full apology. It, it, and that could happen, Jabari, as you asked, that could happen without me. That could happen without me. I would want to be really careful though, because what we don't want is for someone to say something, hey, I'm sorry you felt disrespected. I'm sorry if they use what are called weasel words, because that will just trigger the person again. As soon as you say, I'm sorry if you felt, no, they felt disrespected. I'm sorry this happened is much more appropriate. So that takes coaching, that takes some work. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, Jabari. I'm sorry. In short, I wouldn't necessarily pull myself out and let the two work it out between them unless I was confident that both of them would behave respectfully and are aware of the dynamics of how disrespect operates at a very fundamental, primitive, emotional level. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I hear that. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, with that, I would like to say, Jody, it's so good to see you again. Thank
Ditto.
you. so much for being here. Michelle, a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for being here. And we will say goodbye and thank you very much. And feel free to reach out. And I hope we'll reconnect again. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Chris, where you at in Hawaii? Oh, Chris already gone. Okay.